What is Christian nationalism, and why is there so much discussion about it today? Should Christians embrace it in any form? Is it a serious threat to the church and or a serious threat to the larger society today? My guest today, Neil Shenvi, is an author. He's a friend. He's a PhD in chemistry and a homeschool dad. He's written a great 4-part review of a recent book by Stephen Wolfe called The Case for Christian Nationalism. We're going to unpack that, but also look at kind of broader trends outside of that book on Christian nationalism. Neil, always good to have you back. Thanks for coming on, my friend.
Thank you for inviting me, Sean.
Well, let's just jump right in. When I saw your review, it surprised me on one level because I've seen so much focus by you. You've written that great book we talked about recently on apologetics, defending the faith, but also just critiquing critical theory. When I saw you with a 4-part in-depth review, which we've linked to below, of the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, my first thought was, wow, this took a long time. I know how long it takes to write thoughtful reviews. But my second thought was, I wonder why Neil is weighing into this issue. So tell us.
So it's related. I am best known as a critic of critical theory. And around 2 years ago, though, people began saying, well, you focus on critical theory, that, the sins and errors of the left, but you're ignoring the real threat out there, which is Christian nationalism. So 2 years ago, they were telling me write a review of Whitehead and Perry's book, Taking America Back for God, which is they're both professing Christians, but coming from a more progressive perspective. And they were writing a book critiquing Christian nationalism. So I read that book and reviewed it. And I kind of concluded, we'll talk about this later, I'm assuming, but concluded that what they term Christian nationalism is really a very nebulous category. It doesn't seem to me like a maybe it's just too poorly defined. So that was 2 years ago. And then, though, last year, I was told, well, you have to review this new book in favor of Christian nationalism written by Reformed evangelical Stephen Wolfe called The Case for Christian Nationalism. So and then I posted a tweet about Christian nationalism broadly speaking and said, well, there's some questions that Christian nationalists should answer regarding things like interracial marriage and women's right to vote, things like that, just to clarify where they stand. And that got a humongous response on Twitter, some of it critical, but Canon Press, who is Stephen Wolfe's publisher, posted a link to his book and basically saying, read this book if you want to engage with Christian nationalism. And so I said, sure. So I read that book. And that's how I got into this discussion.
That's real interesting. I hosted a conversation a few months ago with R.R. Reno from First Things and Paul Miller, Georgetown professor who wrote the book, The Religion of American Greatness. And Paul talked about how he started critiquing kind of the right, and then he's working on a project, hence Christian nationalism. Now he's going to turn and do his critique on the left. So same idea as you are. Let's make sure we critique both sides. He just approached it in a different order. Let's jump in and start with a definition. And in some ways, I don't even know what Christian nationalism means. The more I read, the more I find that it has different definitions. People use it differently, define it differently. So give us a definition of maybe what you mean by, or at least you think bubbling to the surface, a common understanding of what Christian nationalism may be.
Well, this is the big problem with the whole discussion right now, because people define that term so variously and so differently. So, for example, 2 years ago, when I read Whitehead and Perry's book, they characterized Christian nationalism on a sliding scale from like 1 to 24, 1 being I reject Christian nationalism, 24 I think being I support it, embrace it. But there 6 questions they asked to deem someone a Christian nationalist were these questions. They said, the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. Yes or no? Agree, disagree. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. The success of the U.S. is part of God's plan. And then 6, the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. And if you said, I strongly agree with all of those statements, or, the ones that are most Christian national, then you get the highest rating. And if you reject all of those statements, or, then you're not a Christian nationalist. But if you really, that was their entire book was based on that survey. And I pointed out that affirming those statements does not make someone, a lot of some of those statements are just sort of either ambiguous, or I would just say just obviously true. So for example, they say things like the success of the U.S. is part of God's plan. And the Orthodox answer is absolutely yes. Why? Because everything is part of God's plan. The fall of Babylon, the conquering, everything is part of God's plan. So that was a very poorly worded question. Here's another one. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. And you listen again, religious, not Christian, religious. And yet if you say, absolutely, I want to have menorahs and Stars of David or Muslim displays in public, well, that makes you a Christian nationalist? That's a weird question to ask. So those questions were just they weren't well thought out. They were poorly worded. So again, that's if they're deeming those statements to be characteristic of Christian nationalism, well, I'm not sure what exactly the problem is. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have people like Stephen Wolfe in his book who have a very clear vision of Christian nationalism, with specific ideas about what it means. And then based on my interactions on Twitter, which is not representative, I understand, but people are just all over the map. Some people just want to have a deep, zealous Christian involvement in politics, or for the government to pass just laws. I'm like, well, yeah, I do too. Everyone wants the government to rule justly, and that's one. On the other hand, you do have people. They're rare, I will admit it, but you have people saying things like, "Well, I'm not sure that races should intermarry." It's very marginal, even on my Twitter feed, but it does exist, and some of these people will claim to be "quote unquote" Christian nationalists. So, what do you mean? When someone says, "Do you support Christian nationalism?" I would just say, please define how you're using that term first.
That's such a good question. Now, I appreciate in that book that they're trying to give some criteria and define it in a certain way that it's research-based. But if I'm not mistaken, in that book, a higher percentage of blacks than whites supported Christian nationalism, which just strikes me as not that doesn't land where I thought that would land, let's just say. There was about 21% of Democrats supported
38%.
38% of Democrats, 21% of Jews, right?
That's exactly right, yes.
Okay, that's where it's so nebulous that I'm not even sure what it means. And even when you say prayer in public schools, is this mandated prayer? Is it optional prayer? Is it prayer in your own time? Like, these nuances make a big difference. And what does it even mean to be a Christian nation? Like, is that an oxymoron? Like, these things, when they're not fleshed out, really lend themselves to ambiguity and a lack of clarity, unfortunately. Now, Paul Miller defined Christian nationalism. He said it's basically the idea that America is a Christian nation and it should stay that way. That is the simplest definition that I'm aware of. And I would tend to say, tell me if you agree with this, that as a whole, when most people talk about Christian nationalism, it's a blending of the American experiment with certain Christian theology and ideas, in particular from the Old Testament. When those two start to get blended together to varying degrees, roughly that seems to be what most people mean by Christian nationalism, in my experience. Would you broadly agree with that?
Yeah, and I think so. But even there, I would want to ask, well, what kind of blending, how much, and which laws?
Fair enough.
For example, when you say in the survey that Whitehead and Perry conducted, they asked, should the government advocate Christian values? I say, well, which Christian values? The value that life has worth and value and dignity, and that we should protect the unborn, and that we should outlaw murder. We all, yes, absolutely. I want the government to advocate for the worth and value of all human beings from womb to tomb. Yes. So you have to be very specific. And unfortunately, a lot of these analyses are almost either ambiguous or superficial, or they link together lots of different sentiments that oftentimes people have someone who is identified as a self-identified Christian nationalist may not, in fact, support every law in the Old Testament becoming a law of the United States. In fact, I'd say the vast majority don't think that. And even theonomists who really want to bring God's law from the Old Testament into the United States as our civil law, but they would, for example, just say, well, all of the ceremonial laws aren't applicable because we're on this side of the cross. So there's so much nuance there that it needs more than just a tossed out a slogan or a soundbite.
Super helpful. Those of you just join us, we're here with Neil Shenvi, unpacking whether Christian nationalism is biblical, an area of concern. When we get towards the end, we will take your live questions. So write question in caps and place it there, and we'll come to your question. Now, maybe make a distinction for us, Neil, this kind of a pop level Christian nationalism that we've been referring to versus the project described by Stephen Wolfe in the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, for which you wrote an in-depth 4-part review. What's the difference between these two projects?
So when I hear the phrase Christian nationalism, I think when most people hear that phrase, they immediately think, the QAnon shaman, the guy with the big Viking hat storming the Capitol, or they think, a guy wrapped in an American flag with, behind the pulpit with a Stars and Stripes display and sparklers on the 4th of July talking about God and country. They think that. Well, listen to these quotes from Wolfe's book. Here's what he says, which contrasts his project of Christian nationalism with that image that might pop into your head. He says, I'm ambivalent about national flags located inside or outside churches, but national flags should not be displayed in a sanctuary and especially not within sight during worship.
Wow.
Wait a minute. That does not strike us as the sort of canonical image we have, at least for me, as of a Christian nationalist. Here's another one. A Christian nation is not a holy nation in the sense that Israel was holy when under the Mosaic covenant. No nation today is God's nation by some special divine command or by exclusive divine favor. So again, that contrasts with views of some Christians believe that America is uniquely anointed, chosen by God to advance his kingdom, and Wolfe denies that. And then finally, Wolfe says the Christian leader must, he calls it the Christian prince, but the leader of the Christian nation must not conflate his earthly kingdom with the kingdom of God. Or Christian spirituality and worship are properly speaking about eternal life, not political struggle. Thus, pastors should not, in their official capacities, at least be social activists or political coordinators, especially from the pulpit. So all of that just contradicts this vision that many people, including myself, have when you utter the phrase Christian nationalism. He's not advocating for this blending, this seamless blending of church and state. He says keep them distinct. They're different things. U.S. is not a chosen nation. Things like that. Flags should not be displayed, even maybe outside churches, even not let alone inside. Definitely not inside, but not even outside, maybe. So again, that's very different from what most people think of when they hear Christian nationalism.
Okay, so this what we might call a more popular version of Christian nationalism, in which some of the promises of the Old Testament are applied to, say, the U.S. government.
Right.
Like we are now the holy chosen nation America is in the way Israel was in the past, or the Constitution becomes inspired in some versions. Right. Not all versions of Christian nationalism go that far, but it seems to be a uniquely American phenomena. Stephen Wolfe's phenomena, if I understand it correctly, is really not about America. It's about any nation, and it's what it means to be a Christian nation that would include America, but others as well. Is that correct, or do I misunderstand his project?
No, you're right. His project is definitely not American-centric. He would say this applies. This is a work of political theology that actually he would say is rooted in historic Protestant political theology out of the Reformation, and so it was really applied first. I think he would argue in Germany and in England and in these places. It didn't come out of an American context originally.
That's a super interesting and important distinction, I think, for folks to keep in mind. Now, maybe one more distinction that would help before we get to some of your concern about Christian nationalism and break down some of the more particulars. What's the difference between, say, classical liberalism that many Christians of different political stripes and backgrounds would broadly support, and the political theology of Christian nationalism endorsed by Wolfe?
So I think he would say, and so again, classical liberalism is also a big tent. What do you mean by that term? I would say, broadly speaking, it's a focus on individual rights. So classical liberalism upholds individual rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of association. And those are sort of core to certainly our identity as Americans. The Constitution enshrines those individual freedoms, those first freedoms in the First Amendment. So that more than anything else, when people talk about classical liberalism, they think about individual rights. And I would say that Wolf is challenging that vision as one that's based not on the Bible, but one that's based on the Enlightenment values, Enlightenment tradition, more than it's based on even a careful rumination on what the Bible thinks about the government, authority, things like that.
Okay, that's helpful. Now that opens a huge can of worms we could go down, his critique of classical liberalism, why many Christians embrace it in some sense. Let's put that on hold for a minute, but just pointing out for folks that classical liberalism is a distinct project that Wolf critiques in his efforts to advance Christian nationalism. Now, what's your sense of how prevalent Christian nationalism is? Because I got to be honest, Neil, I have a hard time figuring out how big it is. Now, I do think on one level, certain popular level kind of unhealthy, unwise blending of the American experiment with Christianity, I think that's pretty prevalent. And it's a lot of people outside of the U.S., like my brother-in-law from Canada, who's helped me see some of those things in a way I probably would not have grown up in this context. But there's also that question and the concern about how dangerous that kind of pop level blending is. But you and I were chatting beforehand that there's a 2022 Pew Research poll. So just last year, it found that 54% of adults in the U.S. had never even heard of the term Christian nationalism. Now, of course, if they don't know the term, there still could be ideas of Christian nationalism that are influential in ways people just can't label it. So I have some concern about it, but the amount of rhetoric and talk that goes into it, I just don't see the data backing it up on that level. Maybe I'm missing it. How concerned are you?
Yeah, I'm not very concerned about the number of people who are out there actively trying to, say, overthrow the government in the name of taking America back for Jesus. I don't think that's a large movement. I don't see it, and especially when half the country is saying, I don't even heard this term. And the surveys are hard though, because like I said, if you go by Whitehead and Perry's criteria, well, according to them, 77% of white evangelicals are supportive of Christian nationalism. But as we talked about, well, so are 38% of Democrats, and 67% of Black Protestants, and 21% of Jews. So the numbers are very hard to come by. I think there are three major streams of a Christian nationalism, broadly defined. Okay. There's Wolf's stream, and he is a Reformed evangelical, and so he's speaking in a very scholarly way about retrieving these classical Protestant ideas about political theology. Then there's a charismatic stream, which I am totally removed from in my just where I am theologically. But I think there are charismatics and Pentecostals who are very in favor of apparently this thing called the Seven Mountains Mandate. You can ask Elisa Childers. We had a conversation with Krista Bontrager and said that she also she's more in tune with these that stream of thought, but I have never encountered it. And then there's just sort of the God and country, call them the MAGA cohort. Just they're very Republican. They're very pro-Trump, and they just want to see we're a Christian nation. We want to stay a Christian nation. And I don't really know much of theology at all. But those are the three streams, and I think they're fairly separate. I don't think that Wolf's book's being read by charismatics. I could be wrong. I just think it's more like Reformed evangelicals. And I don't know how big those camps are, frankly. So I personally, what I'm more concerned about is not, say, someone who says we want Christians to be involved in politics. Well, so do I. We want laws to be just. Well, so do I. I think we all should. People that say things like, well, I think, and maybe people say, well, I think we should have an established state church. Well, I strongly disagree. I think it's a very bad idea, but you're not a heretic for saying that. I mean, you're going to call all Christians prior to like the 1800s in the U.S., they're all heretics? Well, no, it's a wrong idea. I think we've seen bad fruit from that idea, but you're not a heretic for thinking that. And I don't think there are a lot of Americans out there who really want a state church. What I'm most worried about, and I said this in my review, is that under this banner, this broad umbrella of Christian nationalism, there are, especially I think, racist ideas. And I'm not saying how prevalent they are. I'm not accusing that saying that if you're a Christian nationalist, you are a racist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is an overlap there. I'm not sure how big it is. And I worry that under the guise of this big tent, we're going to let certain ideas slip through because, they're Christian nationalists, though. And I think we have to be very careful as the church to guard against that. And I think there are Christian nationalists who have come out even recently and forthrightly said we totally reject all forms of racism in their statement of principles. And I think it's excellent. I want to see those safeguards put in place to make sure that we don't let these really dangerous ideas into the tent and just circle our wagon and say, well, they're one of us. And then that's how we saw this happen with sort of the social justice movement, where people said, hey, there's some bad ideas that they're coming into your movement. And rather than being self-reflective and saying, oh, maybe you're right, they circled the wagons and said, no, how dare you? I think we should not do that. We should say, hey, let's be open to criticism. Let's draw careful boundaries and say what we stand for and what we reject as Christians.
That's super, super helpful. Good clarification. Those of you watching, I'm seeing some comments here. We're going to come back to some specific questions. Hit question in cap, write that in, put your question there, and we'll explore it. Now, you've defined at least 3 different strands of Christian nationalism. But before we get to the critique, what do you think is some of the appeal of Christian nationalism? Because I think some of it might be at least kind of the strong political engagement. Maybe that's MAGA on some level, or even more so kind of the Christian nationalism that Wolf is talking about. There's a lot of people who feel like the culture is in retreat. They feel like they're losing their values, losing their religious liberty. There's kind of a sense and a feeling of despair. And it promises strength and seems to promise a way to fight back. I'm not saying that's all of it, but that might be at least one of the appeals that seems to be a part of it. You agree with that appeal? Would you add any others? Why do you think this is getting so much traction?
So I would absolutely agree. I actually have a willingness to fight on my little notes here, saying that's one of the appeals is that that it is definitely appealing to people that are tired of feeling passive and they're being attacked and they want to fight back. It's not always a bad thing, by the way. If I think when people are experiencing injustice, there is a tendency to want to push back and say this is wrong. So it's not an always evil impulse. But the other 2 impulses are that people are alarmed by the trajectory of society. They see things like people being just vocally, not just, I'm just kind of vaguely pro-choice, but no, abortion is an actual positive good. And we want it to be the law of the land, and we're going to fight for it. People are horrified. I mean, President Biden says things like that. We're horrified. We're rightly horrified by that. We see LGBTQ ideas everywhere. We see, being pushed on children. We see children being transitioned and being sterilized, and Christians are rightly horrified. So I think you're looking for answers, and Christian nationalists are one of many people who are willing to stand up and say, no, this is actually wrong. The second thing I would say is that I think many evangelicals are disillusioned by sort of political neutrality and quiescence, because I think some evangelicals say, well, we don't want to really take sides. And I'm kind of that way. I tend to say, well, I don't want to make this a political issue. I want to talk about ideas. But at some level, ideas are expressed in politics. You can't get around that. Like, take abortion. We can ideologically say abortion is immoral. And you and I would both affirm that, absolutely. But then that has implications for who you vote for. And I know that this caricature is that evangelicals are highly political, but the data actually says the opposite. So actually, just a few days ago, Ryan Burge is a Baptist pastor and sociologist. And I think I saw that there's a survey data showed that atheists are twice as likely to attend political events as white evangelicals. Think about that. George Yancey is a black sociologist, evangelical. In his book, One Faith No Longer, in that book, he lays out the fact that progressive Christians are actually more political than conservative evangelicals, because we get our identity from our theology and they get it from their activism. So the point is that there is definitely a contingent of evangelicals who don't want to have anything to do with politics. And Christian nationalism says no, politics is unavoidable. So let's lay out a vision for politics that's grounded in who Jesus is. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I think it's good to try to make your politics align with what the Bible teaches and who Jesus is.
So do you think on any capacity, we have Christians embracing Christian nationalism? We have some Christians critiquing Christian nationalism. Should we try to recover and use that phrase in any sense, or does it have so much baggage and so much ambiguity that we shouldn't even go there and try to redeem it?
So I would lean toward the latter thing you said, which is that it's just got so much baggage in the mind of the average person. And I just go further than that. 2 years ago, when I first read Whitehead and Perry's book and saw sort of more progressive media saying that Christian nationalism was a threat to democracy, I looked into this data, this research, and I thought, this is just being used as a label to tar, this pejorative label to tar any Christian with traditional beliefs about abortion, homosexuality. It's just being used to smear us. So I just came out and said, look, this is just a vague term. It's just being used as basically slander. Well, I was just boggled my mind that then Christians a year later are embracing that term. It's just like why would you do that? I felt like you're playing into their hands. They're at that point, I was saying it's basically a boogeyman. They're trying to scare you into, well, these guys are going to take over the country and install a Christian monarch. And then a year later, Christians are saying, yes, we are Christian national. I'm like, what are you doing, guys? So that's my prudential judgment is it's a bad label to self-identify with. That said, if you really feel like, no, it's a good label, I like the label, I think it's unwise. But what I'd say is just have some clear statement of beliefs that you endorse as a Christian nationalist, that when someone says, well, are you against interracial marriage? You're like, no, look at my statement. I have a literal document I signed that says this is what I mean by that term. Now, I think you're still going to have that term used against you. Yeah. But at least you've been clear on paper for everyone to see that what you believe is out in the open. We're not hiding secret beliefs. We're clear on what we stand for.
That's really helpful. Now, before we jump into kind of Wolf's case and what he means by Christian nationalism and your reflections on that, I'm curious if you think the term, and you kind of hinted at this, Christian nationalism has become a conversation stopper against what tends to be conservative Christians, and that could be theologically or politically, to just lump people into a category and reject them and not have a nuanced, careful conversation in which you have to consider their arguments. Now, before I let you respond to this, I'm not saying this is unique from those on the left. Last week, I had somebody call me out and say, Sean, you're going woke. And first off, I laughed. I was like, okay, I might have my issues I'm working through. That's not one of them. But that word from the right can be a conversation stopper to label people and not have to deal with their arguments. So I think this is a human phenomena that we can do, but we're talking about Christian nationalism. So I get the impression all the time it's just thrown in there to dismiss somebody, to demonize somebody, that stops a conversation in a way that avoids even having to take somebody's nuanced arguments seriously. Do you agree, or do you see it differently?
I agree, and it's one of the reasons why I think we shouldn't adopt the label. Because if you say, actually, I am woke, I am a Marxist, I am a fascist, I am a Christian nationalist, even if you've defined those terms in totally different ways, it's still going to just play into their beliefs about what you represent. So I would just say, well, ditch those terms as labels and find ones that will lead to further engagement. That said, you should never use those terms as a conversation stopper. When I use the term woke in quotes, I always define it, or I try to define it. Here's what I mean by that. Here are the ideas that are represented by that label, and that's what I want to go after. But yeah, if people are using it to stop conversations, don't. But at the same time, I would say, well, that's one of the reasons to not use that label for yourself. And there are other ones out there. I mean, my friend Josh Dawes uses the term Christian federalism. What does that mean? Well, that's great. I'm glad you asked. It's what it means. Just a way to force them to engage the ideas and not the label.
I prefer the term Christian theocracy. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. Yeah.
Nobody quote me on that. I'm kidding. Definitely would not use that term. In fact, I think that's an oxymoron, but I digress. Okay, let's shift more to Stephen Wolf's case. Again, you have a 4-part review I hope folks would look at, and for even more depth than we'll get into here. But he has a certain version of Christian nationalism that he's aiming to defend. Now, this has 3 key pillars that he talks about. And this is more of a movement of political theology, very distinct from popular kind of versions of Christian nationalism that we've been talking about. There's 3 pillars. Let's take them one by one. One of the pillars is his understanding of the nature of man. How does that play into his program?
So he thinks that the fall, it removed basically our heavenly gifts. That is, we were separated from God. We were condemned as sinners. So he's a Orthodox Presbyterian in that sense. We inherited a sinful nature from Adam. But our earthly gifts, like our natural, our nature, our earthly nature, was not really tainted by that. So what is natural is still, we're naturally oriented towards, I should find the quote, but towards good things. And when I asked him about that, because that sounds very strange to me.
Yeah.
But what he seemed to mean is we still would rather eat food than poison. We still want to have a wife and a family. We still want peace and not war. We don't want to just go around murdering people. But this is maybe a difference there. But he would just say there's still that mark of God's nature on us, so that we don't desire spiritual good. We don't. We're fallen, and yet we are naturally oriented to health, to happiness, to even if we seek those things in the wrong and even evil ways. So that plays in a lot to how he sees things like society, ethnicity, government, nation, because he'd argue that prelapsarian man, that's before the fall, man before the fall, and man today, we have the same sort of earthly nature. And so what if we, people today, he's right, we desire to be around family and friends, people that are like us. He says that natural pull, attraction towards your people is a natural thing, and therefore a good thing. It's actually a word he uses. It's natural, therefore good. And that plays largely into his beliefs about, say, the nation. The nation should be a collection of your people that you feel like an identification with, and that's a natural and therefore good impulse. So a lot of his anthropology is rooted in this idea that our nature did not change due to the fall, that we still on an earth, he's talking about, he believes in original sin, he's a Presbyterian, but he's saying that what we gravitate towards at an earthly level is still what is there's continuity between that and what Adam felt before the fall.
Okay, so if you're going to have Christian nationalism, it's a version of nationalism, and his argument is that nations, and hence some kind of naturalism, is a prelapsarian kind of, it's a truth before the fall, built into the fabric of the world that God made, and so it's hence good and can be used to defend the idea of distinct nation groups that should exist as distinct nation groups.
Exactly.
Is that
right.
fair?
So he actually has an extended argument saying that if there had been no fall, Adam's children would still have created separate nations. There would not have been one. There would still have been government. There would still have been a military, even in an unfallen, sinless world. And that's crucial to his argument about, nations today.
Okay, let's move to the second pillar, which is the nature of civil government. He has a certain view and approach to civil government. What is that, and how does that play into his larger project?
So he would argue that that nations should seek the heavenly and earthly good of their people, and this is key: heavenly and earthly good, both goods. That's what governments are for, and that a Christian nation then has a government which seeks the heavenly and earthly good of the nation in Christ, because the only way we can really secure heavenly good, eternal life, is through Christ. We know that as Christians, you can't find eternal good apart from Christ. So a Christian nation is one that realizes that, and therefore orients its whole governing framework around pointing its citizens towards their ultimate good, both on earth and in heaven. So that's what it means to be a Christian nation, is a nation which is overtly explicitly seeks to point its citizens towards both their earthly good and their eternal good.
Okay, now let's just unpack this for a second. There's a quote that I pulled out from his book. He said, "A Christian society," and right away when someone says a Christian society, that's a red flag for me, and I wonder, what exactly do we mean by a Christian society? Was Jesus's program to create a certain kind of society versus the church? That's just a question I throw out there. He says, "That is for itself will distrust atheists." Now, that makes me really uncomfortable that you would have built into a civil government that says if you are of a particular faith, or in the case of some atheists, the lack of a particular faith, we're going to distrust you. That seems to me that's going to just fray apart the civilization on one level. Second, I know a lot of atheists I trust a lot more than some people who are Christian or who claim to be Christian. We've seen a lot of fallen leaders recently. So for us to point and say, we don't trust you, I'm not sure I want to do that. But he says the society creates distrust of atheists, decry blasphemy, correct any dishonoring of Christ. So it seems like there's this shift in civil government, that the government is now going to play a certain role of who we trust, who we don't trust, regulating blasphemy, and also correcting a dishonoring of Christ. That's where I would hit a pause and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure. Actually, I don't want to say this hesitantly. I do not believe that's the role of the civil government to do so. Now, the role of the government might be, we're not going to have blasphemy against any religion, so to speak. That's a different question than uniquely against Christianity. It also says, orient life around the Sabbath, frown and suppress upon moral deviancy. Now, of course, part of the role of the government is to frown and suppress moral deviancy, but which kind and why? Mm-hmm. So tell me your thoughts on this kind of quote and this idea of the role the civil government would play in his project versus the role that the church would play in his project.
So, and it's very clear that he is operating from a different paradigm than classical liberalism, or than the one enshrined in our Constitution, where he's saying that no, the government should be in the business of promoting Christianity, not just a moral society, not just some religion in general, but Christianity. And even now he would hedge this a little bit. He would say Protestant Christianity, that should be the government's goal. Now, this will be very important later. He does strongly recognize the role of prudence in government. So he would deny that we can go from like 2023 America to in 2024 we're going to have a Christian prince who puts all the atheists to death. He would deny that. He would say, no, you can't do that. We can't go from 0 to 100 in a year.
Okay.
This is all in principle. He would say prudentially, given the demographic makeup of the U.S., given the fact that we have non-Christians, atheists, Jews, Muslims, Hindus all living here, they're all American citizens, given that state, we should not try to impose these like say, Christian Sabbath laws, because we're going to have revolution, literally. We can't do that. So prudentially, this is the ideal. And I like to say this. If Christians found a colony on Mars in 10 years, we create an evangelical Baptist colony on Mars, or perhaps Presbyterians say. Okay. And then what are our laws there? I think it's fair to say, would it be unjust for an evangelical Presbyterian colony on Mars to say, hey, we're going to have Sabbath laws? Would that be wicked? I'd say, well, I don't think it's wicked. It's their choice. It's their country now. It's their colony. Would it be wrong for them to even have blasphemy laws and say, you can't curse God, your savior? I think it's not unjust. Now, you could say, I think it's maybe unwise or imprudent. Okay, that's different. This is all for him an exercise in theoretical thinking. What is the ideal state? And then we can't get there, but how can we approach that? Or how close can we get given, say, our demographics, given the existence of non-Christians all around us? So my point is there but he does affirm an ideal that is very different than, say, maybe you or I would affirm, where he says elsewhere that it is right and just to execute heretics, or maybe not execute them, maybe just exile them or imprison them. But he would have no problem. And I'm not talking about like revolutionary. We're talking about just people saying things like, I disbelieve in the Trinity, and teaching other people the Trinity is not real. Well, that would be enough, say, to get you thrown in jail in an ideal society in his mind. Yeah.
That's crazy. I think the real difference is the role of the church and the role of the state. So heresy, to me, this is a question of church discipline and pastoral leadership, not the issue of the state. Because the moment the state has that power, yeah, maybe in some ideal world, they wield the sword perfectly. Never going to happen when politics come into place. So it sounds nice on paper, so to speak, but that's never going to be practiced fairly. And you know what? Somebody's orthodoxy today is going to be heterodoxy tomorrow. And I think this is just a recipe for disaster, as I see it. Let's keep going. The third one is this idea of the Christian prince, which I thought was so interesting. Let me read a quote that he has in the book, and you can unpack this. He said, the Christian prince can adorn himself and his residence with Christian symbols, as crosses were once painted on royal armor. His military or militia, which defends a Christian people and their church, can be designated soldiers of Christ. So in Wolff's plan of Christian nationalism, who is the prince, and what does this prince do?
Now, he uses the term Christian prince not because he wants a monarchy necessarily. He just,
Sure.
That's the Christian leader. That's what he means. Christian magistrate. And so he's like the leader, but he's more than just like a bureaucrat. He is supposed to inspire people. Elsewhere, Wolff says he stands in relation to people like God. He's like the closest thing to Christ on earth. And I get the actual quotes, but he says things like that. It's an exalted figure, charismatic figure who's looked upon as people with reverence and awe. And he inspires the people to follow Jesus and to aspire to be like Jesus. Anyway, so it's more than just a president. Okay. And he does have these repeatedly this extremely exalted language intentionally to describe the Christian prince. Now, here's again where I would put this is all ideal. This is all theorized as the ideal. But here's what I'd say. But look, what you just said, Sean, is right. We all Christians actually believe there is an ideal Christian prince. His name is Jesus, and one day he will come to earth and literally reign here. But we're all fallen. And the point that I'm making is prudentially, it is extremely dangerous to put that kind of power in the hands of any fallen human being. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And even if you have the ideal Christian prince today, he might even be like, look at King David. King David fell from
Good
grace.
point.
King David did terrible things. And that was the best sort of earthly king that Israel had. So my point here is that there's the idea of separating out the ideal from the sort of prudential concerns, but we're living in a real world. So saying, well, in theory is so impossible to reach given our fallen condition, that this is why the government of the United States and the founders in their wisdom have checks and balances, separation of powers, because they saw the danger of giving one person all of this power. I mean, Wolff's Christian prince has the power to call synods and to enforce certain doctrines as the official state religion. He says that. Again, this is all in theory.
Sure.
I think you and I both say that's dangerous because maybe today the Christian prince is a Baptist. But maybe in 5 years or 20 years, his son is suddenly Catholic or suddenly Mormon. And suddenly it becomes a whole new law. So I think prudentially, in the long term, I'd rather have a government that's limited to prevent ever going into this totalitarian, tyrannical direction, especially an anti-Christian one.
Okay, so as soon as people hear the idea of the prince, they hear this idea of this strong figure who is moving the nation where it needs to go. Obviously, in the back of some people's mind is, well, what about Trump? What about Trump? I meant combine Prince and Trump.
Yeah.
What about Trump? And I have no idea if Wolff says, oh, he's kind of a precursor to that, if he's in favor of him, because I realize that's different than the kind of MAGA crowd Christian nationalism. But he kind of fits, at least in some level, this idea that he's talking about. So how does that mix in as a whole in his project and or just Christian nationalism, the role that Trump plays here?
So interesting. I've not one time have I seen Wolf in any way promote Trump. Just not. I think it's just not in his wheelhouse. In fact, I would
Interesting.
argue he probably would say Trump's not a Christian prince because Trump's not a Christian. He would be forthright. I don't know. I can't speak for him, but
Yeah, fair enough.
he's envisioning a
Okay.
true believer, like a true
Okay.
Christian who is a genuinely good
Got it.
man, devout man. So I think, yeah, certainly there are people who look to Trump as kind of almost a savior figure, maybe not a Christian figure, but a Cyrus figure, an anointed figure that God's chosen to lead the nation, even though he's not a Christian. But Wolf's Christian Prince is not that. He would say, no, this is an actual believer, a regenerate Christian who is truly seeking to establish justice and promote the worship of Christ
Okay.
in the nation. Yeah.
That's really interesting because I was just searching Christian nationalism today to see how people are talking about it. And there was an op-ed. I mean, it was in New York Times and the Washington Times or Post. Like that term pops up and it's being used everywhere. But so frequently it's tied to the Republican Party. Wolf's understanding is like, no, this isn't about Trump. This is a very different project than what he means by the way it's used in the public conversation, which is why definitions and clarity are going to be really, really important. Okay, now one other concern that you have, again, this is in your review, we've linked to it below, was Wolf's understanding of ethnicity. Maybe walk us through what that concern is.
Sure. So Wolf actually says he uses the terms ethnicity and nation almost synonymously. So they don't mean what we mean, because obviously our nation, the United States, is inter-ethnic. There's lots of ethnicities represented in the U.S. So he's using the two words synonymously. He says that. And he doesn't even define it clearly. He says explicitly it's hard to define what you mean by nation. Okay, so I go, why are you using those words? Well, the closest he comes to defining ethnicity or nation is your people, or maybe we might say people group, right? So the people that you feel like are your people, that nationhood should grow out of the sense of identifying with some people tied to some particular land, some geography, some sense of place. And that is how nations are formed. Now, okay, that's a little weird use of ethnicity, the term, but that's what he's doing. I think, but no matter how you understand that term, he says things that I think are actually troubling. So here's one from page 148. He says, people of different ethnic groups can exercise respect for difference, conduct some routine business with one another, join in inter-ethnic alliances for mutual good, and exercise common humanity, e.g. the Good Samaritan. But they cannot have a life together that goes beyond a mutual alliance. So he's talking now about, sense of your people, which it is somewhat your ancestry, but also it's your culture, it's your sense of place where you live, your community. But he's seeming to say that there's certain boundaries in terms of civic life that you can't really cross in terms of feeling like these are your people. Your people are your people, and you don't really want to mingle with those people. And I think that no matter how you parse that out, it's just not compatible with the way Christians should think about people groups. The example I give in my review is that in New Haven, where I lived, my men's small group had a Romanian grad student. We had a Ghanaian medical student. We had a white hedge fund manager. I'm half Indian. We had a half black, half Native American carpenter. And these were my brothers.
Amazing.
These were my people. And we had life together. And so one of the reasons that I steadfastly reject critical theory is because it's going to divide the church along lines of race, class, gender, etc. And I have to reject Wolf's visions of ethnicity for the same reasons, is because he's also going to divide and fracture the church along these ethnic lines. Now, I get it. He's not clear on what he means by ethnicity, but the things he says, they don't work with how the Bible commands us to view other believers as family. The Mediterranean world of Paul's day was very mixed. People traveled around. It's all just one big jumble. You had different ethnicities in the same city. They're all Roman citizens, for example, and yet they had this. They were united in the church under Christ's lordship, and that has to be how we view membership in the body of Christ within the local church.
I love that, Neil. This brings us to a question from Joel, who's been with us, I think, from the beginning, that relates exactly to what you're saying. He says, question for Neil. Over and over, we've heard the use of nuance when it comes to Christian nationalism. Yet this same level of charity was not afforded to Christians who felt CRT had some value. Why?
Well, two things I'll say. One is that one of the problems with Christian nationalism we've been talking about is it's not clear to define. Like I look online and I see 10 different definitions. In contrast, if you go to critical race theorists from 1989, when Crenshaw coined the term, to today, Bridges, CRT, Primer, 2019, they're very clear what it is. They have core defining elements that have existed for 30 years. They're clear about it. So there's not ambiguity. Well, what do you mean by that term? Because it's literally in the literature. You can look it up. And there's very little disagreement over what it means. That's one thing. The other thing is, though, that I personally, I can't speak for everybody, but I have tried to be very nuanced in what I think about CRT. So if you look any of my writings, I'll often start with, well, here are the positives, the things that we can affirm as Christians, and only then say, but fundamentally, these ideas are wrong. So I can't speak for everyone, but I do try to at least aim for nuance, even when dealing with an ideology that I think is as unbiblical as CRT.
That's great. Good answer. Now, I have a couple more questions for you, but there's some questions here coming in from folks who are joining us that I think will be really helpful. Thanks for your question, Joel. Sure. Let's jump to Rob Mangum asks a question. In some ways, you kind of addressed this a little bit, but he says, how does our natural and therefore good, according to Wolfe, desire to group with our kind square with God's desire for every tribe and every nation to be grouped together in heaven?
Very good question. And I agree that if you look at the trajectory of the Bible, if you look at the Tower of Babel, when the nations were dispersed, we see that was a curse that is then reversed at Pentecost. So it's almost like God saying that there's the effect. And I'm not saying that it's not wrong to feel like you have some people that share your family, your ancestry, your culture, and to feel a closeness to them. That's a good thing. I agree with Wolfe. That's a natural and good thing. But we also see this call in the Bible that go out to the nations and to bring people into God's family from every tribe, nation, and tongue. And also, I point out in my review is that there are multiple competing goods. So, for example, the desire to have a wife who loves Christ and who shares a calling with you and you share interests, it's good to have that desire. But that wife might be from, I don't know, Zimbabwe. But if she's a godly, loving woman, then your desire to be with your quote unquote own American people and your desire to marry this godly woman you can't have both. But obviously, you can't say, well, that one overrules that one. No, it's like there are many goods that you can't have the good of being a doctor and being a lawyer and being an Olympic athlete. So it's not a sin to choose one to prioritize. Well, I just feel called to do this or that. So the point is that you can't exalt, say, the desire to share culture with your people. That's a good desire, but it's not the only good. There are other goods that can relativize that good. And so we can certainly say things like maybe you're called to be a missionary. You have to leave your family. You have to leave your culture and go to spread the gospel to some foreign culture. You can't say, well, my desire to be with my people is going to overrule God's call to be a missionary. No, it shouldn't be that way.
Good response. Again, very thoughtful. Let me bring one over to you here, and I'll give my 2 cents real fast, and you jump in. It says, is there a historical example of someone who did a good job representing Christianity in politics? Someone we can model ourselves on. I only see Jesus stiff-arming politics, Matthew 22. Now, I would say really quickly, I'm not sure Jesus stiff-arms politics in Matthew 22. That is the parable of Jesus with his disciples, and he responds by saying, give to Caesar that which is Caesar, give to God's that which is God's, in reference to the religious leaders trying to trap him of whose face is on the coin. Will he pay taxes or not? I actually think in part what Jesus is doing is saying the image of Caesar is on this coin, so give it to Caesar. But where's the image of God? Everywhere. So God's authority is everything. So I don't think he's stiff-arming politics. I think there's a sense of respect the state's authority, but God is authoritative over everything. Now, that doesn't tell us how to carry that out, but I'm not sure that I would agree that Jesus is stiff-arming politics. In terms of a practical model how to do this is somewhat outside of my lane. I would just point to people with a prophetic voice like Wilberforce and Martin Luther King Jr. That's very different, fighting injustice, than just living out as a Christian in politics well. First off, do you disagree with my take on Matthew 22? And would you have anything to add about just a good example of someone who did a good job representing Christianity in politics?
Yeah, I almost heard that the image thing. I agree with you, but he said, "Whose image is this?" Well, but where's the image of God on human beings? We bear God's image, and so he's saying, "Give Caesar the coin, but give yourself to God." Anyway, but yeah, it's more the same thing. He's not saying that, "Oh no, I don't have any implications for politics." Well, Jesus is king over all earthly kingdoms, and so
Amen.
he has definitely a say in politics. In terms of, but I agree, role models, man, I'm the wrong person to ask. I think one of the problems is that whenever you take any figure you want and say, well, this person was a Christian witness in politics, that person is also a sinner. And so you're always going to, whenever you think, well, it'd be like saying, name the most godly pastor you know. And you can, but you're always going to find someone to say, but look at this thing that he did. And like, look, or they take King David, right? So the danger is that when you say, well, here's some moral exemplars for us, there's certainly people that did politics that are better than others that try to be a Christian witness. But I think, especially in politics, it's easy for our political opponents to then point out the errors and inconsistencies in their life. And so that's why I think it's hard to find an exemplar. They're going to model our political engagement after this one guy. The only guy I can point to as a wholly and exemplary person is Jesus. Otherwise, we're all kind of messed up. But mainly I'm just saying I am not into politics, so I'm not a good person to ask.
I would agree with that about myself as well. Here's a question for you from Michael Jones at the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. Engaged a lot of the same issues that we do here. He says, question for Neil, is there any place in the Gospels where Jesus can be understood as being against Christian nationalist ideas? My mind goes to Satan tempting Jesus with power. So obviously he's not asking, is there a specific place where Jesus cites Christian nationalism, because it's somewhat of a modern phenomena that we have either in America or political theology. But are there any other specific examples of ideas that tend to be embedded into Christian nationalism, such as the search for power, which we certainly see at times within Christian nationalism, that Jesus pushed back on?
So, like I said, it depends what you mean by Christian nationalism and what ideas. But I want to probe this idea of power, because I think it comes up a lot. So a lot of critics of Christian nationalism will say they're just seeking power. It's all about power grabbing. But I want to push back on that and say that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might sound horrifying, but think about it. When we try to advocate for anti-abortion laws, want to abolish abortion, we're seeking the political power to do that. Now, we're not seeking political power. I'm not, just because I don't want to run for office. I don't want the power myself, but I want a government with the power to protect the unborn. When we push for civil rights laws, we push for anti-discrimination laws, we do those things, and implicitly we are seeking power, like it or not. And you might say, well, I'm not seeking it for myself. Well, that's the point. Christians seek power not for themselves, but for the good of their neighbor, for the good of the vulnerable especially. You want to protect the powerless. The most powerless people in the U.S. are the unborn. So the point is that I want to be very careful to say Christian nationalists are seeking power. I would say, well, why aren't you? In the sense that you're not seeking power for yourself. You're seeking the power to do what is good for your neighbor, to do what honors God. So we got to be very careful, because I think one of the things that attracts people to Christian nationalism properly is the sense that Christians have lost the will to use power to stop evil. Now think about that for a second. You mentioned William Wilberforce, Martin Luther King. They were seeking political power to fight evil. How is that a bad thing? Where would we be without their movements for justice? So my only point is I just want to be very careful writing all of this politics stuff off as a sub-Christian and worldly. We should. Oh, sorry, I pulled out my.
You got excited. I do the same thing.
Was that?
I get excited too and hit stuff all the time.
Yeah, right. I would just say that I think that there's absolutely a place and even a command in the Bible to restrain for the government to restrain evil. It's Romans 13. It's government's for restraining evil. And because we're living in a democracy, we've been given the privilege of choosing our government and shaping it. So you and I have power. We have it in the right to vote. So we're going to wield power. The only question is, are we going to wield power to do what's good and to promote what's right? Or are we going to just toss up our hands and be like, I'm not going to use my power? We're going to use our power for evil. Those are only real options. And I think Christian nationalists, even if you disagree with them strongly, you can admit that, yeah, we have to rethink this aversion to power. Because really when you what is the quote? The only thing needed for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There is evil in the world, and we know that ultimately the answer to evil is the cross. Ultimately.
Amen.
But Martin Luther King, man, he's the one who said, the law can't make you love me, but it can keep you from lynching me. And so we should be seeking to use our right to vote and whatever power we have to create laws that promote human flourishing and prevent evil. That's what they're for.
That was a very, very thoughtful response. I did not expect that, but it makes sense as I'm sitting here thinking, because especially in the work on critical theory that you do, critical theory, in a sense, sees the world through power dynamics, oppressed versus oppressor. And the Christian solution is not to make all power equal and to get rid of those dynamics. It's to yield power well, with humility and with justice in the right way, not getting rid of power, but using the power that God gives you well, right? With power comes great responsibility.
Oh, there you go.
I had to bring it.
All right. You had to bring it on.
I'm actually wearing a Spider-Man shirt, believe it or not. So
yeah.
I had to bring it full circle. Okay. So we got to, and there's some other good questions here, but I want to definitely respect your time. Let me bring it back to this and wrap up with this. Are you concerned that Christian nationalism is just a bad idea within the Christian fold? Or do you think it's actually heresy? Because I've seen some Christians call it heresy. And of course, we have to define again what we mean by Christian nationalism. So if you took kind of the pop Christian nationalism, and that doesn't always entail Trumpism, but that tends to be a piece of it a little bit, and kind of this project that we've been talking about by Stephen Wolfe. Would you say these are inside the Christian fold, but you take serious issue with their practice in theology? Or would you say they might even be outside the Christian fold, these ideas are heretical?
Yeah, I mean, there are occasionally some really fringe people. Like I saw some self-published book called like Son of God, Son of Man, and had a picture of Donald Trump's face on the book cover, like claiming that he's the Messiah. Just insane stuff like that. Yeah,
okay.
That's heresy. Okay, you think Trump is the Messiah, you're a heretic. But what Wolfe, for example, is doing, he, like it or not, he is basically in line with what lots of believers thought prior to like the 1800s. Right, this is a classic Protestant theology and Catholic theology, and so unless you want to write off all Christians prior to like America as heretics, you can't call it heresy. I don't think that. Another thing is that if you took it ideas, if you ask him flat out things like, "Do you think that laws can save the soul?" He will say flatly no. In fact, he says explicitly in his book that the law by itself, a civil law and civil government, a Christian nation, a Christian culture by itself can only produce hypocrites. It can never save a single soul. He will say that repeatedly and outright. And I've never met a single evangelical Christian nationalist who thought differently. They will completely agree that all that laws can do is constrain evil and encourage good behavior, but it cannot change the heart. It cannot save the soul. It cannot forgive sin. So yeah, if someone were out there saying, if we pass enough good laws, we can make the nation Christian, we'll go to heaven. That's heresy. I agree, but I've never met a single person who says that. So I would be very hesitant to use the heresy label. In the same way about social justice and wokeness. You tell me the idea, and I'll tell you whether or not it's compatible with Christianity and whether it qualifies as heresy. But I would just be very hesitant to do that. And when you're saying that, explain what you're targeting explicitly, and maybe even ask them, well, do you believe this? And like I said, oftentimes they'll say, well, no, I don't believe that. And that's why I do think I think Joe Rigney said this earlier, but he said, if you look at the Christian political tradition for the last 500, 2,000 years, you'll find that America's the outlier. We're the outlier. Democracy and freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Now, we could be right. I'm not saying we're therefore wrong, but it takes a lot of chutzpah to say we alone are right and all the rest of us, all the rest of Christians throughout history have been heretics. It's a little bit presumptuous. So I'd be pull back on that tendency, critique these ideas, reject them, but don't write them off, certainly without asking people and asking good questions.
Super helpful, man. I always appreciate how careful you are, think about these issues, and just are always gracious with folks who see things differently. It's awesome. Now, is the cat out of the bag on your next book, or is that under the wraps still?
No, it's out of the bag. You can look at my Twitter profile, pinned tweet.
Okay.
There's a book coming out October 3rd. I'm co-authoring it with Patrick Sawyer. It's called Critical Dilemma, and it will be, we hope, the definitive response to critical theory in the church and society. So it's very thorough, hopefully charitable, fair, but it makes the case that critical theory, critical race theory, queer theory, these theories are undergirded by ideas that are fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. Full stop. So you can look at it's available for pre-order right now on Amazon if you want to pick it up.
Oh, wow. Good. Yeah. Well, your publisher sent me an early PDF of it, and I was skimming through it going, holy cow, this is thoughtful and exhaustive. Is it about 500 pages? Did I get that about right?
It's. I think it will be under 500 pages, but it contains 770 plus footnotes. So it is thorough. And it's accessible.
Fantastic.
So my 14-year-old son read it, parts of it, and he read it, he could understand it. And so it's not totally abstruse and hard to read. It's got illustrations, pictures, diagrams, but it will be definitive, we hope.
Well, I can't wait. We're going to have you on for probably 2 or 3 hours in depth going through the book. We'll post that on a Monday. And then that week, early in October, on that Friday, we'll invite people to post their tough questions all week. And then you and I will go live right when that book comes out to take the toughest challenges. So I can't wait. Appreciate you a ton. Looking forward to have you back on. Before we go, those of you who are watching us, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other interviews and conversations coming up you will not want to miss on a range of apologetic and worldview and different cultural topics, including some of the latest research on detransition with an expert on this. So make sure you hit subscribe. If you thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you in our apologetics program at Biola. It's the top-rated program. It's fully online distance program. We have students from around the world. Now, if you're thinking, I'm not sure everybody do masters, we actually have a certificate program. We'll kind of guide and walk you through just formal training in apologetics, and we've got a significant discount code below. So check that out, and don't forget to pre-order a copy of Neil's book. Neil, appreciate you, my friend. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Sean.